And welcome to Humanist Canada's webinar series. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Anna Popovich with Humanist Canada and I will be your host today. We also have Martin Frith, the president of Humanist Canada. And Martin, over to you.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank all of you for joining us today on this webinar series. Most importantly, on behalf of the Board of Humanist Canada, wanted to acknowledge, as we all know, how difficult a time this is for every one of us amidst this COVID pandemic. But more than ever, it's also a time that we really acknowledge how important critical thinking is and how good science is to the future of all of humanity. So thank you to Anna Popovich, our program director at Humanist Canada, and to our speaker today, Chris DiCarlo, and for what no doubt will be a stimulating conversation. And it's important probably at this time to be talking about things other than the pandemic. So with that in mind, thank you once again for joining us. Oh, back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Martin. A couple of housekeeping items. First, you are attending in listen-only mode. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes in length with time allotted for Q&A at the end of the webinar. But if there are more questions coming, we will extend it by 15 minutes. We will use the Q&A tool for questions. If you have questions, you can submit them with the Q&A tool and we will deal with them along the way or at the end of the webinar. I would like to start the webinar with a quick poll. We have a full e-house today and would love to know what province you're calling from and what motivates you to join us today. So if you can please take a moment to complete the polls and Martin will share the results as they're coming in. Can you launch the poll, please, Martin?
It is launched.
Okay, I don't see it on my end. Oh, I do now. Okay, great.
Sorry, I just will relaunch that. So sorry to everyone.
Okay. See the results coming in. Alberta, BC, and Ontario. Thank you. And if we can have the second poll, please. Thank you, Martin. If you can take a second and specify the reasons for why you're joining the webinar. Okay, with most people interested in the topic, and if you can share the results, Martin, that would be great. Thank you. Great. Thanks for doing that. The title of today's talk is Critical Thinking in a Post-Truth World. With advances in technology throughout the world, it has become more difficult to determine what is legitimate news or information and what is fake news, as we all know. The tools of critical thinking provide us with the abilities to analyze information, understand the importance of bias and context, consider what counts as evidence, and be able to identify fallacies or errors in reasoning. And our presenter today is Dr. Christopher DiCarlo. He is a philosopher, educator, and author. He is the principal and founder of Critical Thinking Solutions, a consulting business for individuals, corporations, and non-for-profits in both the private and public spheres. He is also the ethics chair for the Canadian Mental Health Association, a lifetime member of Humanist Canada, proudly, and an expert advisor for the Center for Inquiry. He currently teaches at Ryerson University and is a past visiting research scholar at Harvard. Chris has won several awards, including TV Ontario's Big Ideas, Best Lecturer, and Canada's Humanist of the Year. He has authored several books, the latest of which is entitled So You Think You Can Think? Tools for Having Intelligent Discussions and Getting Along, which will be released by Rowman and Littlefield in June of this year. Congratulations, Chris, and over to you. And thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Martin. Yes, so today I'm going to talk to you about critical thinking in a post-truth world. And in order to get that going, I'll share my screen with you. And here we go. There we go. Okay, so I have a new book coming out, as Anna mentioned, So You Think You Can Think. And basically it's called what it is because I'm trying to raise the level of civility in having conversations about important issues. And what I've seen as an educator over the past 20 to 30 years is that there's been a glaring lack of critical thinking being taught at a number of levels of education, from grade school to middle school through high school and certainly into college and university. And so I'm very much interested in getting these skills back into the education curriculum at all levels. Now, I do think it is possible to have heated discussions and you can disagree, and I still think it's possible to be able to get along. But unfortunately, what's been happening in the world is because of things like, Brexit and this gentleman, the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016 was actually post-truth. And this is a bit of a sad commentary on how information is delivered and interpreted and acted upon. And what happened was, by repeatedly stating talking points, even if it involved false information, various politicians and pundits around the world basically said, whatever they felt was appropriate, and to make their point, and they used what are called echo chambers to make these points. This is a media term that refers to the uncritical way in which information gets out into the public in an uncritical and an unchecked way, and it can even be untrue. And it's stated over and over and over again in these echo chambers until it's accepted as truthful. And what happens is it can be checked, but sometimes it's challenged by those who are claiming its very untruthfulness. And that's a problem, because what's happening is things are taking on the characteristic of what Stephen Colbert called truthiness, where truth comes from your gut rather than from books, or it's something you want to be true about the world rather than what is actually true about the world. And this is dangerous because it's hauntingly familiar of what was happening in World War II when Joseph Goebbels said, if you tell a lie big enough, you keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. And the lie can only be maintained for such a time as the state can shield people from the political, economic, or military consequences of the lie. So it becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Now, the problem with this is that once fake news becomes accepted as factual, it feeds on what's called confirmation bias. and it becomes entrenched in the minds of people who really want to believe it to be true, whether it is or not. So in attempting to respond to and correct the falsities, those who wish to fact check these types of claims, they often come under attack as belonging to some kind of grand conspiracy who are trying to, ironically, suppress the truth. Now, post-truth politics makes considerable use of conspiracy theories. If you try to criticize these theories with things like facts, you're considered to be like a member of the mainstream media or a member of the establishment, as it were. In critical thinking, this is called insulating one's views or one's argument against criticism. So you deny the very capacity or potential for criticism. An attempt to make a claim impervious to scrutiny or criticism. But you can't have that in critical thinking. And hopefully you can't have that in society in general. In order for us to live in free and just societies, all information, no matter how offensive or how unsavory, has to be open to criticism and scrutiny. And this is without exception. So it's time to make facts and critical thinking sexy again, right? This is my mission, my Socratic goal in life, is to bring back the relevance and importance and need for critical thinking. Now, it's become very fashionable over the last 4 years or so seriously as the facts about those issues. Now, emotional attachment to specific viewpoints and the facts about them are two entirely different things. Now, it's not as though a person's feelings are not to be validated. They are. However, they should only be validated up and until the point where there's a conflict with one's feelings and the actual facts. Now, for the record, a fact is often defined as a thing or information or a statement which is demonstrated to be true, often by appeals to evidence. Opinions are people's personal judgments about something or some information or statement which is not necessarily based on fact or knowledge or proof or certainty. And we need to keep these things fairly distinct. Now, I'm very impressed that media outlets like the New York Times have produced guidelines and online courses to assist in training people to better understand information and to make discernments between what can be considered factual and what is simply opinion. And you can even take a quiz. I've put a URL at the bottom. We can post this later. You can take a quiz to test how capable of this basic critical thinking skill you are. Now, here, this is obviously a false statement here. The New York Times, billionaire businessman kicks black family out of public housing. Well, the black family are the Obamas, right? So clearly you have to read carefully and you have to see such an obvious satire. Michelle Obama's mother refuses to leave the White House and claims that the White House is her reparations and whatnot. So once you read into it, you realize it's a joke, it's funny. But we need to be media savvy now more than ever because we're inundated with all kinds of information, especially from online. And critical thinking allows us to make better discernments of that information and to step back from it for a second and to ask the types of questions we need to ask in order to better think about the types of information that we're inundated with on a daily basis. Now, the term better, as in there are better and worse ways to think about things, implies that there's value to our beliefs. There's value to our ideas and our opinions, that literally some ideas are better than others. Well, that's true. That's just simply a fact, and we have to accept that. When we come to think, though, of what makes these ideas better and worse, and how do we measure them, and who determines these values, right? Luckily, throughout history, much of the hard work has already been done by people like philosophers and mathematicians and scientists and logicians and writers and many others who have contributed to developing the critical thinking skills we currently can use today to discern this information that comes at us. So what I've done over the last 25 years or so, as I've taken these critical thinking skills,
All your preparation.
and I've distilled them into 6 easy to remember steps. So basically, in all of my books and in all of my lectures, these skills come as a handy mnemonic for the first 6 letters of the alphabet, right? So A is for argument. An argument is how you structure your ideas. We'll look at this in more detail in a few minutes. B is for bias, and we'll look at this as well. We're all biased. We can't escape bias. No human being can. It's just a part of who we are. But we can acknowledge biases, and then we can try to better understand when these biases are affecting how we look at the world or how we look at a particular issue. Right? Context is extremely important, because if you take information out of context and then you apply to critique or accept that information, but you've gotten the context wrong, it ends up being irrelevant. It has no actual application in the real world. Diagramming our arguments allows us to better see what they look like on paper. Evidence, of course, as Martin and Anna referred to, is extremely important, especially at a time that we're faced with today. And fallacies are errors in reasoning. People often state certain ideas or opinions about issues and whatnot, and then we can point out where they have been mistaken in terms of reasoning and whatnot. Now, you see how it complies with the first 6 letters of the alphabet. If you can remember those first 6 letters and what they stand for, it's much easier then to remember what these tools are of what I call the basic critical thinking skill set. And then they become much easier to apply in your day-to-day living. So combine these steps, these tools, create this skill set, which allows any of us to have a greater capacity to have really more meaningful discussions about all issues, regardless of what they are, from the simple, to the sublime. And it allows you to be empowered, because you're better able to understand this information and appreciate it and discern and examine it and critique it, so that you come away as a more empowered, more enlightened, more reflective individual. Now, I don't teach people what to think. That's pretty much up to them. I don't tell people that they have to think about certain things in a particular way. My job is more about how we think. I'm much more interested in the rules that govern better and worse ways in terms of thinking about things. And there's a big takeaway here. And that's essentially that the more empowered we all are to have these meaningful discussions about important issues, and we're going to disagree, let's face it, but we still have to be able to get along. We still have to be civilized and appreciate that people are going to have differing views of opinion. Now, you're going to see through this talk, some of my biases come to the surface. I can't escape them. None of us can. But if we can appreciate what those points of view are and how we arrived at those points of view, we should be able to have more meaningful discussions and not dislike the other person simply because they disagree with us. This ties in very well with the concept of fairness. It's what I call the golden rule of dialogue, or the cornerstone of critical thinking. And believe it or not, fairness, you learned it in kindergarten and it still applies for the rest of our lives. If we all play fairly, then it doesn't matter if we disagree. If we're playing fairly, we should be able to realize that these differences of opinion are going to occur. And, we want to play fairly simply because it's, in critical thinking, acceptable for us to be able to do this. It shows a level of intellectual maturity that we're going to have these disagreements. So we need to relearn how to disagree and still be able to get along. And this requires maturity. It requires an element of diplomacy. But above all, it requires fairness. And in today's age of immediacy, where information and opinions are just a click away, there seems to be less and less time for us to practice these types of skills. And maybe this is one of the reasons why so many people are feeling their way through issues rather than critically thinking about them. Now, in what I call an alternate Trump universe with alternative facts and post-truth policies and so on, there is a great need for clarity. There's a great need for empowerment in the presentation of our ideas and directness in communication of our thoughts. People need to know, not only when they're being lied to or presented with alternative facts or post-truth politics or double spoken to in a hauntingly similar manner to that found in Orwell's 1984, people really need to be able to call it for what it is, bullshit. And they need to be able to understand that nuances and the qualities of such statements, we should be able to hold others accountable for their beliefs and especially for their actions. Now, in ancient Greece, because I'm a professor of philosophy, in ancient Greece, what we find is that there were a group of philosophers known as the Sophists. And these were some interesting characters. They were very well-educated people. They could travel from towns to town, and they could entertain people with their brilliant debating abilities. They would literally brag that they could make the worst side sound the better. So they would take any issue, any topic whatsoever, and ask for what the worst side is. And then they would proceed to argue and try to convince the majority of people that their side was in fact correct. Now, this bothered Aristotle a great deal because he was noticing that they were essentially con men. They were hucksters. They were using rhetoric basically to try to influence people with pretzel logic and emotional appeals. And in the meantime, they were committing all kinds of fallacies and errors. And so what Aristotle did is he set out to create a system of logic which would stop them in their tracks and allow people to be empowered to be able to do the same thing. And what he did is he came up with these three, what he calls the three laws of classical thought and classical logic. And I'm going to whip through each one of these to show you why each one of these is so important. And what they do is they lie at the foundation or the basis of the most important foundational criterion for all of human reasoning, and that's consistency. So if you see anything online or you watch anything on television or you read something and it bothers you, consistent in some way. And we all have this meter built into us, this kind of fairness and consistency meters within us that see things and realize, wait a minute, there's something not quite right about that. It was Aristotle over 2,200 years ago who figured out what is at the basis of what's bothering us when we encounter bullshit. And what is it that, gets our baloney detector, our bullshit meter off the scale when we see and are experiencing information that just isn't true. So he called this the first law, the law of identity. And it's the most basic law. It really just means X equals X, where they're the same thing on either side of the equation. And this law becomes obvious, when you look at things like when somebody tries to say a car is not a car or a grizzly bear is a paper airplane, right? When you violate these types of laws, you immediately realize an inconsistency. So you don't want to, mistake a grizzly bear for a paper airplane. And so here are some of the examples that are fairly common. To say Raymond is completely bald means Raymond has no hair. That Canada has witnessed peace for over 50 years means Canada has not been at war for over half a century. And the current temperature is 32 degrees Fahrenheit is the same as saying it's 0 degrees Celsius. Now, you might think, well, this is obvious, this doesn't tell us much, but it does. This law allows us to understand things for what they are and distinguishes them for things that they are not. And it provides order and consistency to our world. Imagine a world in which people or statements or objects randomly change properties and functions. So for example, you tried to get into your car one day and it turned into a giant banana, right? Or on some days it rained water, and on other days it rained Skittles. Or on some days gravity worked, and on other days gravity didn't. We need nature and logic and human reasoning to be consistent. Otherwise, we find this innately unsettling. In case you're wondering, if you look at certain world leaders and you find them to be inconsistent, one of the main reasons why this bothers all of us at a cognitive level and at an emotional level is because we're not sure we can trust this person. And we need to know that there's going to be consistency in our lives. Consistency gives us a greater sense of security and a greater sense of control over our environment. We've been trying to do this since we've been evolving for millions of years across the African savanna. We need to know, or we have a great desire to know, that the future is going to be consistent with the past. And when there are world leaders who are inconsistent, it really shakes us to the core. And if you're wondering why, it's because of these three laws of thought that Aristotle developed and pointed out in such a cogent way. Now, the second law is that of non-contradiction. Basically, this just means that you really can't have an action and the opposite action to be true at the same time and in the same respect. So I can't be clapping my hands and not clapping my hands at the same time and in the same respect. That's contradictory. So, for example, the statement, the Toronto Blue Jays won the 1993 World Series and they lost it, defies the law of non-contradiction. You can't say that. It's one or it's the other. Basically, it's kind of like saying you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can have your cake or you can eat it, but you can't have both. So it's a very foundational law that lets us know how you can maintain consistency and avoid causing inconsistencies. And then the third law is known as the law of excluded middle. Literally, there's no middle. There are options at either end, either or, but there's really no middle. There's no, it's impossible for, for example, for somebody to be a little pregnant. You either are pregnant or you're not, but there's no such thing as being a little pregnant. So what Aristotle did is he came up with these three laws, and they underlie the criterion of consistency, that our statements and our beliefs should be consistent. And if they're not, oftentimes the reason why is because they violated one of those three laws. Now, I have a clip here I'll play, and I will try to share that with you. Let's see.
She's been proven to be a liar on so many different...
Here, let me just go back and share. All right. There it is. All right. So here's a number of inconsistencies.
She's been proven to be a liar on so many different ways. This is just another lie.
Well, I'm just quoting you when
There's no quote. You're not going to find a quote from me. I don't know Putin.
Do you have a relationship with Vladimir Putin?
I do have a relationship.
I was in Moscow a couple of months ago. I owned the Miss Universe pageant, and they treated me so great. Putin even sent me a present, beautiful present with a beautiful note. I spoke to all of his people.
I never met Putin. This is not my best friend. I was in Moscow recently, and I spoke indirectly and directly with President Putin, who could not have been nicer. And I got to know him very well because we were both on 60 Minutes.
This is a person who has been very cavalier, even casual about the use of nuclear weapons. He's advocated more countries getting them, Japan, Korea, even Saudi Arabia.
North Korea has nukes. Japan has a problem with that. I mean, they have a big problem with it. Maybe they would, in fact, be better off if they defend themselves from North Korea. Maybe they would be better off, including with nukes. Yes, including with nukes.
And South Korea with nukes.
South Korea is right next door.
He was for the invasion of Iraq.
Wrong.
And you can actually hear the audio of him saying that.
Are you for invading Iraq?
Yeah, I guess so.
He applauds people who are pushing and pulling and punching at his rallies. That is not who America is.
So if you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees.
He also went after a disabled reporter, mocked and mimicked him on
Wrong.
national television.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. Oh.
He insulted a former Miss Universe, Alicia Machado, called her an eating machine.
Give me a-
And on the
She was like an eating machine.
She weighed 118 pounds or 117 pounds, and she went up to 160 or 70. So this is somebody that likes to eat. Nobody has more respect for women than I do. Nobody.
So you treat women with respect.
I can't say that either. Ultimately, Ivana does exactly as I tell her to do.
Right, man? Is that right? If Hillary Clinton thinks she'd get 5% of the vote.
he said that he could not possibly have done those things to those women because they were not attractive enough. Look at her. I don't think so.
Look at her words. You tell me what you think. I don't think so.
I did
Them
not
to
say
be
that. I
assaulted.
did not say that.
And about another woman, he said, that wouldn't be my first choice.
She would not be my first choice, that I can tell.
I didn't even apologize to my wife, who's sitting right here, because I didn't do anything.
He apologized to me, and I accept his apology, and we are moving on.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Oh, hang on.
I am officially running.
That's enough of the Donald. So what we have here is quite a few examples in which one individual who happens to be the leader of the most powerful nation in the world defied the most basic laws of reasoning and thought. On other occasions, he's actually stated that pictures of his inauguration were wrong, that they had been doctored and were misleading. He said he had the largest turnout in the history of all presidential inaugurations. And he also said that it didn't rain at his inauguration, that God stopped the skies from raining, even though here's his wife sitting with an umbrella and all these people are scrambling to put on ponchos, and you can literally see water droplets everywhere. So, you know, these are things that really never happened. And yet Trump, he's such a good marketer. He believes if you just keep telling the same lies and you just put them into the echo chamber and let those lies continuously get told over and over and over again, that like to echo, you know, Goebbels, people will come to believe them. So how does that make you feel? How does that make us feel, right? I think it can be summed up in a single stare from Michelle Obama at his inauguration. This might be what she looked like on the outside. She was probably feeling a little more like this, though, on the inside. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, agreeing and getting along is easy. You know, disagreeing and getting along requires the continued and consistent use of critical thinking skills. But like anything worth pursuing, this takes time and it takes practice. And so what we'll do today is we'll just look at a few examples. We can't go very deep into all of the various tools in the critical thinking skill set. So I'm just going to focus on a few of them. The first one being, you know, what is an argument? And what we want to do is we want to hear what the other person is saying in the best possible light, because this is fair, right? Even if we disagree with them, we have to put our ideas into the form of arguments. We have to figure out, you know, what is it we're trying to say? But what is an argument? The best way to think of how to put your ideas into the form of an argument is to think of a house. Whatever you believe is, just consider that the roof of your house. Donald Trump is the greatest president in United States history. If that's your conclusion, fine. That's your roof. That's what you believe. Or you might believe he's the worst, right? Or Justin Bieber is the greatest pop star of all time. Or the Toronto Maple Leafs will win the Stanley Cup when we get through COVID-19. Whatever your beliefs happen to be, you know, your conclusion, consider that your roof. Now, the reasons for believing that, your walls, are called premises. And your walls support your roof. Now, you want your walls to be really, really strong, because if your reasons for supporting your roof aren't very strong, then your argument becomes weakened and the roof collapses. The walls themselves, or your premises, have to rest on a foundation that's made up of these universal criteria. We just saw consistency with the 3 laws of thought, but there are 4 other very important universal criteria, and we're going to look at each one of these. Relevance, simplicity, reliability, and sufficiency. These are really, really important to determine the acceptability or refutation of premises. And, you know, taken together, they provide the most firm foundational basis for our beliefs. So if we disagree with somebody's argument, what we try to do is show how their reasons for believing their conclusion doesn't satisfy any of these 5 foundational universal criteria. So there were a number of different types of criteria we will look at. By the way, I should tell you, I am going to pick on Donald Trump a fair bit and use him as an example. And it's not necessarily as though I want to do that. It's just that he makes it so easy to do it. And I feel compelled to call him out because he shows some of the most glaring lack of critical thinking of any political leader in American history. So these 4 criteria are very, very important to be sure if a premise isn't, say, relevant to a conclusion. If we just look at relevance right now, then it has absolutely no power to convince us that we should accept that person's belief or that person's conclusion. Now, do you remember when President Trump was talking about the coronavirus, you know, just a week or so ago, he was saying things like, you know, my uncle was he was at MIT, he taught at MIT for a number of years, he was a great super genius, Dr. John Trump. And in reference to epidemiology in general, Trump said, I like this stuff. I really get it. People are surprised that I understand it. Every one of these doctors said, how do you know so much about this? So here we have a case where a president can go on international media to let the citizens of America and the rest of the world know that he's at the helm and that he's in charge and he knows what to do. But, you know, he says, maybe I have a natural ability. Maybe I should have done that instead of running for president. On social media, the reaction to Trump's comments were quite harsh. One Twitter user wrote, the guy who looked into the sun during a solar eclipse thinks he could have been a research scientist. You know, we have to ask ourselves the very important question. How, in fact, is lying, bragging, and presenting falsehoods in any way relevant to Trump's argument that he's in control of the COVID-19 pandemic? We know he is clueless in many regards, and that much of what he says is irrelevant because several days later, March 27th, to be precise, he said this: you call it a germ, you can call it a flu, you can call it a virus, you know, you can call it many different names. I'm not sure anybody even knows what it is. That's embarrassing. That's embarrassing to the point that we would have to apologize to aliens if they were looking in on humanity at this particular point. Virologists, microbiologists, epidemiologists, millions of scientists know exactly what it is. Exactly what it is. It's a coronavirus. It's a novel, new form of coronavirus. And so much of what Donald Trump has to say contains no relevance. And so we can't accept anything he's saying. In the Washington Post, conservative Jennifer Rowman said this: Trump is incapable of mastering any level of detail or accurately conveying it to the public. He either cannot remember or never understood what he's supposed to roll out, and instead often chooses to make himself look better. His penchant for ad-libbing, as he did with the disastrous results during his Oval Office speech, causes more chaos and confusion. Trump has neither the mental capacity nor the emotional tools to lead in a crisis. Increasingly, the best course of action seems to be to let him blather, but then hand off matters to the real adults who can correct his misstatements or take action in the real national interest. So without relevant premises, an argument structure collapses and cannot stand. And I believe Dr. Anthony Fauci can sum up this very sentiment of how useless and irrelevant Trump's ad-libbing has been with a particular facepalm. So, you know, if you are bothered by what is happening by certain levels of leadership in the world, it's really these skills of critical thinking that will provide the clarity to understand what it is that they're lacking. So in that case, Trump fails, his reasoning and his argumentation fails, does not comply with the foundational criterion of relevance. What he's saying often goes off script and often just refers back to himself. Be that as it may, that's what narcissists tend to do. And clearly, you know, in that way, he can be called out for his lack of relevance. Now, when we look at the criterion of, say, simplicity, this is often valued to support premises if we can present arguments that can accomplish just as much, but with fewer premises, so we don't have to complicate things. It tends to be more highly valued. It's not always the best way to go because some arguments are very, very complex, but oftentimes, if an argument can be stated in more simple, basic terms and accomplishes just as much, then it tends to be highly valued. It refers to what's known as Occam's razor. This was named after a 14th century Franciscan scholar and friar, William of Occam, and he basically said, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. You don't have to say more than is required, especially during times of emergency or importance. So you really don't need any more premises than are necessary to support a particular conclusion. He seems to be the originator of the KISS principle, right? The idea if less works, then you should use it, right? So when faced with competing arguments, the one that can say more with the fewer premises is often the one that is favored and valued. So a painful but obvious example of this can be seen in the Iranian downing of Ukraine International Airline Flight 752 from Tehran to Kiev on January 8th, 2020. In response to this, at first, Iran, there was just total denial. No, we did not do this. And then they came out with a statement that their missiles could not possibly have struck this plane because it was at an altitude of 8,000 feet, which is incredibly bogus. Then they said it might have been a rogue group of rebels that did this. And then they finally admitted responsibility that it was an accident. So it turns out this, you know, the simplest explanation was actually the correct one. Somebody screwed up and a horrific disaster occurred. The same thing can be said about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, right, in the Saudi Arabian consulate in October of 2018 in Istanbul, Turkey. At first they denied, right? And then it turns out that they finally had to accept the fact that, yes, something was amiss, and the whole world knew this. So the simpler explanation turned out to be the acceptable and more valued one. Now, the fourth universal foundational criterion is reliability. And what this means is we want to make sure that however which way we want to support our premises for what we believe, that information has been gained in a very reliable manner from reliable sources. So it demands that we attain information from trustworthy sources and that we do not shirk our responsibility in this regard. So many people around the world formulate opinions about extremely important issues based on information they find on Facebook or Twitter. And we know that this type of social media platforms are filled with false information from various sources in attempt to sway public opinion. In fact, we know the 2016 elections were largely compromised because of activities of other countries that had basically saturated falsehoods and bogus information online so that people would read it and believe it and then pass it, and that this information itself becomes viral, and then people repeat it often enough, as Goebbels warned, as Goebbels said, they repeat it often enough so that it just becomes accepted. And that's dangerous. And critical thinking allows us to cut through that and to stop that so that we can better check the reliability of information. And finally, premises need to be sufficient. There need to be enough of them. In critical thinking, we talk about premises providing a conclusion with a sufficient amount of evidence. But how much is enough, right? When do we have enough premises to sufficiently support our conclusion? Some good advice comes from Carl Sagan. He said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And if we think about this for a second, it has the ring of truth to it. Basically, it means that the larger and more impactful one's claim is, the more we are going to require for that person to provide sufficient evidence. So if you think that Elvis Presley did not die, but was abducted by aliens, hey, good on you, but I'm not going to believe it because what evidence do you have in support of that, right? So if your claims are absolutely extraordinary, you better expect somebody to require for you to state what those extraordinary, how that extraordinary claim is backed by sufficient evidence to support it. Now, if you want another obvious example of this, a lot of people believe in this hairy simian 8-foot character parading around, the Pacific Northwest, Sasquatch known as Bigfoot, and lots of people believe that this being actually exists. But the evidence I don't find to be sufficient. You have this extraordinarily grainy footage of a person in a suit walking along, and you have these big footy prints in the snow that people have been making casts of, and then you apparently have sounds and whatnot that people hear at night in the forest and so on. But look, to sufficiently convince me or anybody that Bigfoot exists, all that is required is a single premise. Show us a body. Just you find a Bigfoot, dead or alive, we pretty much have to go where the evidence leads us. So then we have biologists examine the creature. We make determinations as to what its DNA is, what its type is, how it gets categorized into the biological order of things. And then we listen to what the world's experts tell us about this, who know far more about biology than anybody else. And we then make determinations as to whether or not that evidence is sufficient in convincing us to accept the conclusion that Bigfoot actually exists. Right now, you can believe that Bigfoot might exist, but until you have solid evidence gained in a reliable manner that demonstrates relevant and consistent information, and that is overall sufficient, that is to say, there's enough evidence, then until then, why should I believe that such a being exists? I have no reason to. So I basically maintain that until somebody comes up with better evidence, no, I don't believe such a being exists. So you would have to make that determination for yourselves, whether or not, given whatever evidence is available out there, you think such a being as Bigfoot actually exists. So if the premises of an argument properly comply with these 5 foundational criteria, sufficiency and simplicity and relevance and reliability and whatnot, if the premises comply, your house stands as a fairly solid structure. And if they do not comply with these foundational criteria, well, then this is what happens. And that's basically the nuts and bolts of A is for argument. Whatever it is you believe, just make sure you've done the work, you've done the necessary homework to make your walls as solid as possible. And how do you know if your walls are going to be solid or not? Depends to the extent that they've satisfied these underlying 5 foundational criteria. So that's A is for argument. Let's take a brief amount of time to consider another tool in the critical thinking skill set. B is for bias. If you disagree with somebody's conclusion, their argument or whatnot, step back for a second and try to consider what their biases are that might have led them to believe what they currently believe, especially if they disagree with what you believe. So if you encounter, say, a Trump supporter, okay, you don't have to be angry or cruel or derogatory towards them at all. Try to understand why, if you're not a Trump supporter, why do they differ in their beliefs from you? What biases might be involved on both sides of the issues? What has gotten you to these different points of understanding information about the world, right? I mentioned quite a few different types of biases in my lectures and in my books, and there are essentially 2 types. And we all are a product of these biases. We have biological ones, our genetics, something that's known as epigenetics, our neuropsychological influences, how our brains function, our age, our health, our sex. These can all influence the way in which we interpret, understand, and act on information. And aside from the biological biases, we're also dealing with a huge number of cultural ones as well. How we were brought up, how we were raised by our families, who our friends are we religious or not religious? Where do we get our information? What forms of media do we trust? Do we just get our news from Facebook, or do we use other sources? How are we educated? What is the extent of our education, right? All of these factors influence and constrain how we read, interpret, understand, and act on information. And I often get people to do what's called a bias check. So it's very easy to practice this. The next time you come across something online or on television or through any other form of media, as you're making an opinion about that, step back from yourself and ask yourself, why am I thinking this way about this particular issue? And could I be thinking about it differently if, say, I were raised in another part of the world? Or if this were 100 years ago, might I be thinking differently than I now am? So you need to understand, we all need to understand that there's no such thing as a purity of perspective. All perspectives come shaped by the ways in which we have been biased throughout our lives. And this is something we need to appreciate, both in ourselves and especially in those with whom we disagree. Because if we can better understand that, it goes a long way towards better understanding things like the context in which information is housed. So if you're wondering why, say, President Trump won the 2016 election, maybe it's because a lot of people in the Midwest were tired of the way in which politics was chugging along, kind of the same old, and they wanted to try somebody who was a little bit different. So we need to be careful about the ways in which we understand information based on our current biases. Let's just look at one bias. Let's look at education. Now we can see the ways in which education plays out differently in the world. If we were educated in, say, rural parts of Pakistan, we might only be learning, and it'd be predominantly male education, we might only be learning from one particular religious text, the Quran. The work that I've done with the previous provincial government, the education minister here, is I was able to produce a addendum to the curriculum, the high school curriculum, to bring in critical thinking into that particular level of education. And I'm currently trying to get meetings with Stephen Lecce to further this, to see what might possibly develop in the future in terms of bringing critical thinking into high schools. Now, let me finish up by demonstrating to you that there are, in fact, good world leaders out there who do give a damn about education and critical thinking. So in 2017, I was invited to Ireland to meet with the president, Michael Higgins, who's an absolutely wonderful human being and a very well-educated, very well-spoken person. If you're wondering what he's like, just think of the opposite of this gentleman. But the fact of the matter is, don't despair. There are world leaders out there who give a damn about knowledge, education, and things like critical thinking. So to conclude, let me say that critical thinking tools are basically those which will allow us to think more clearly and responsibly, and really just better about important issues, and that we can have intelligent discussions. And we're going to disagree, but we have the civility to be able to get along. And we need to understand that throughout what we're experiencing now, I cannot overstate the fact that we need to keep truth and facts at the height of information and decision making. And that I hope that at some point in the near future, we can once again acknowledge the importance of truth and facts, which will hopefully make conversations great again. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for the very informative presentation. Thanks a lot, and thank you for your time. And we do have a couple of questions lined up already. And the first question is from Bruda, asking about the infodemic in the context of COVID-19. If you have comments on the scale of misinformation. Yes.
So, you know, there's a lot of myths out there about COVID-19, and there's been a lot that have been debunked. I don't know if everybody's familiar with these. Some of these myths have been circulating, that stomach acid kills the virus, and drinking hot water with lemon and whatnot, and gargling with warm water, and consuming large amounts of alcohol and cannabis, although probably quite enjoyable. There's really no evidence that these things work. So there are ways to battle misinformation, especially now during the time of COVID-19. And you know, I can point you to like Snopes and PolitiFact, factcheck.org, the Washington Post has a fact checker, as does the New York Times. There's Facts Canada. The BBC has one as well. I think Reality Check in the United Kingdom is a great one. Newswise and various other organizations have these debunking sites that any of us can access and then gather reliably obtained information.
Okay, here's a big question that I know you've been handling a lot. Someone says God exists. I say there's no evidence. So how do you address faith-based questions?
If that's just kind of a general question, basically, you know, 80% of the world's population believes in some type of supernatural divine being or set of beings and whatnot. Understanding biases, I think, is extremely important as to why people would have supernatural beliefs or metaphysical beliefs, while others do not. And we also have to appreciate the fact that those beliefs, supernatural beliefs, are going to be extremely important to people. And they tend to appeal more to the kind of limbic center of the brains, the emotional centers of the brains, rather than the prefrontal cortex. And that means they're going to feel those beliefs very in the strongest possible way. So having discussions about them will help if people know going in how, in fact, important those beliefs are. And you can't just simply present logical arguments in ways to try to refute them, because emotion often doesn't care about logic. That emotion will override logic, especially if those beliefs are housed within a community, a family, and societies that all support and provide a basis of comfort and nourishment and what we would call confirmation bias for those particular beliefs. So that's a very, very difficult question to deal, or an issue to deal with. But we should be sensitive to the fact that people are going to disagree with us, and we're better to understand the way in which those issues are housed in terms of the kind of the bigger critical thinking picture.
Okay, here's a question from Robert, who wants to know what would be an effective reply to someone who says it's true for me. We're all free to have our own truths.
Yeah, as Moynihan once said, yeah, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And yeah, you can't, this true for me concept, I'm interested in the etiology of it. Like where did that come from? And I don't want to just point my finger and blame the postmodernists who try to, push an agenda that there is no real privileged view of the world. But I do want to say that there are better and worse ways of thinking about information and thinking about the world. And to say that's true for me, hey, that's great, but reality is going to, teach you a really, really nasty lesson. If you think you can fly off a 20-story building by flapping your arms, and that's true for you, reality is going to show you otherwise in a really nasty, horrible way. So we can't just let people get away with that's true for me, because that relativizes and diminishes truth to the level of utter subjectivity. And I definitely don't think we're ready to live in that type of, epistemologically anarchic society. I think there are better and worse ways to interpret, understand, and act on information.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from Dr. Marty Shoemaker, who says, hello, Chris, we'll go way back to Imagine No Religion conferences. What do you think about a series of books and research that critical thinking is primarily a male use of the left hemisphere and has been done to excess since the Renaissance onward? And this has led to being to missing intuitive truths all around us.
Okay. I would need to know maybe some examples of what those intuitive truths are, because I do call out intuition in my lectures and in my books, that on one level it seems to be a decent way of understanding what's going on in terms of context and whatnot, but often intuitions clash. And so I don't know about this kind of male-dominated left hemispheric tradition with critical thinking. I think critical thinking is a constantly ongoing self-correcting enterprise of trying to be more responsible about understanding and interpreting and acting on information. I think it's far more reliable as a method than simply relying on intuition. And I mean, that's an entire series of books in itself talking about intuition as a form of understanding and acting on information. And we certainly don't have the time to devote to it right now, but I do appreciate the question.
Okay, another one from Tanya. The government is being hesitant to release information on incidence and mortality modeling results of, and sorry, these questions just jump around, of COVID-19. And I lost the question as they're coming in, but the question is, what's your response to the government's response, I guess?
Yeah, like I was very appreciative of what Mr. Ford did in having modelers go ahead with the Ontario prediction. That's good. Prime Minister Trudeau is hesitating because I don't think he feels there's been enough data collected by the provinces to indicate that we have a robust model nationally. However, what I do think the media seems to be doing is still focusing a lot on the doom and gloom aspects of COVID-19. And for all of those listening, one of the things I really do want to emphasize is that with any pandemic, the order is always going to be the same. Okay, it's always going to be the same, and it's always TIAV, right? T is testing, I is isolation, A is antivirals, and V is vaccine. And it's always going to go in that order, especially if we have a virus that has either a large, long incubation period or people are asymptomatic, which is what we're seeing now. My colleagues and I have been warning that this is going to be occurring for over 25 years now. We've written to Chinese officials, we've written to our own politicians, trying to get somebody to wake up and pay attention. And the fact of the matter is, here we are, we're in it. And the reality is, because it's asymptomatic and has a long incubation period, we have no defense other than massive testing and isolation. And obviously that's what we're doing. That's what we have to do right now. What you need to keep an eye on and what the media needs to report more often on is, where are we in terms of antivirals at this stage? Antivirals are a type of treatment, not necessarily a cure, but a treatment so that people won't die if they have in the severest cases. And a vaccine, if you're hoping for a vaccine anytime soon, don't. I mean, vaccines, as I mentioned in my latest book, you know, I go through the 3 phases of drug trials and how these things actually come to be. It does take a long time for vaccines to develop. It would have taken a shorter period of time if more coronaviruses, so that we would have been better prepared to develop them a little more quickly than we now are. But that's essentially where we're at right now. So the next major stage in all of this will be the development of effective antivirals. Those will come I would think, long before a vaccine. And that's when you will start to see a fairly significant drop in the curve, because people who are suspected of having it, who are at risk, will be able to take those antivirals and stop the deadliest effects of the virus. But there's at least 500 trials worldwide right now of antivirals, and hopefully we'll see something over the next few weeks about that.
Okay, thanks. There's a comment about the importance of setting context when we see scandalous headlines in the newspapers, and I'll move on to the next question. If someone asks you the following question, what is your ultimate goal in life? Most likely the answer will be to be happy and satisfied. Then shall we always do things which make us happy, whether they're ethical or not?
That's a classic philosophical question, right? If we just do things that make us happy because we maintain that that's the goal of life, you have to realize that, like Newtonian physics, every action has an opposite reaction. So if something's making you happy, at what expense to others, and not just humans, but other species as well, is it causing? So, you know, the basic rule of liberty politics throughout history, going back to Mill and even back to Plato, is that, sure, have a good time, but don't make others worse off or the environment or other species. You can't make them worse off in doing that. So if you can figure out how to do that, that's great. You should be entitled to do that. You should have that kind of liberty or autonomy or freedom to be able to do that. But we are a complex web of members living in a society. So the politics and the mathematics get very, very complicated very quickly. So within a confined area, if you can be happy without making others worse off, hey, more power to you. But you always need to think of, you know, the golden rule and the no harm principle. Those are the two most powerful ethical precepts of humanity.
Okay, if I may insert a question of my own.
Sure.
You are the ethics chair for the Canadian Mental Health Association. As a specialist in epistemology, how would you diagnose the current state of the mental health profession and landscape in Canada? And if you have any recommendations, that's a fascinating issue in terms of application of critical thinking, right, to a mental health sector.
No, that's an excellent question. I mean, you know, I first of all, let me say that I think those on the front lines are doing the very best they can with what little they have. Everybody's an expert, you know, when it comes to mental health and what should be done. The fact of the matter is those who are involved in it work long hours and are trying to make the system better, constantly trying to make the system better. And it's, you have to imagine the mental health system in Canada as though we are a ship at sea, and that the ship is containing, that the wooden ship contains lumber, and that you have to repair the ship while it's at sea. You don't have time to dry dock it and work on it and shut everything down and then relaunch the ship. You have to fix the ship while it's at sea. So it's, you know, it's constantly this very difficult process of trying to bring a lot of moving parts together and into focus so that we can provide the very best care for the greatest number of people. Are we woefully lacking in funding for mental health in Canada? Absolutely. But then it gets pushed to the politicians to try to make determinations as to, well, where are we going to get the money then to give people in need the type of care that is required? So it's a very, very delicate balancing act in terms of how we're going to justify who gets what type of care, when, and how. Obviously, you know, I have a grand view of how I think the mental health field should work at all levels throughout Canada, but I'm just one small cog in the giant machinery that is, you know, Canadian mental health. Could it be better? Absolutely, but it could also be a lot worse. So, you know, trying to keep this ship afloat and repair it while we're at sea is no easy task. I think better bringing together the sciences, I think, is one of the most important thing. I'm a great advocate for what's called relational systemics. So I'm a person who likes to bring systems together from all levels so that we can treat an individual comprehensively rather than in silos. So we need to understand various facets going on within a person's life in order to give them the very best care we can possibly give them. And that requires a fair amount of restructuring and reconsideration. But things are tending to move in that direction. That is becoming gradually the model for understanding and dealing with mental health. So I am very hopeful. I am quite optimistic.
Okay, and we have time for one last question, and I'll combine two. How can you be a good decision maker, and how do you critically analyze belief systems?
Yeah, decision making. In order to make good decisions, you have to be very well informed. Otherwise, you're going to make a decision based on partial or perhaps even irrelevant information. So whenever we get information, if it looks somewhat suspicious, you need to cross-reference and to check and to double check before you start to make decisions. So, for example, I remember when Kobe Bryant's helicopter crashed and it first appeared online. It was on Facebook. Well, you have to cross-reference. You have to find out whether, in fact, that piece of information was true or somebody was circulating a rumor or whatnot. And so there are ways in which you can do that. in terms of critical thinking, I think one of the most important things to realize about critical thinking is it's not a quick fix, and it's not necessarily easy. It is something like learning a language. It takes time, it takes practice, and it's something that you have to do over and over and over again so that it becomes habitual. It just becomes a part of who you are, so that it just becomes natural to apply this particular skill set to the type of information we experience every day. And that's something I'm hoping to develop across this country and hopefully throughout the world, in terms of trying to get people to become a little more responsible in how they interpret and understand and act on information.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you all for joining us. And just a couple of things before we end this session. You will receive a follow-up email from Zoom with an invitation to fill out a post-webinar survey, and we always appreciate our audience's feedback because it allows us to improve. You can also suggest a speaker or a topic of interest to you. So if you do have a moment, please complete the survey. If you are able and would like to support our work during these challenging times, including our webinar series, you can do so by making a donation. Just follow the link included in the same post-webinar email, or simply recommend our webinars to a friend or spread the word about our organization. And finally, the next webinar will be on Sunday, May 17th at 3 p.m. And our speaker will be Jasmine Mohammed, who is a Canadian human rights activist who advocates for the rights of women living within Islamic majority countries, as well as those who struggle under religious fundamentalism. And on behalf of today's webinar team, myself, Martin Frith, and our presenter, Dr. Chris DiCarlo, thank you for joining us, and please stay safe and connected. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.